Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to a special May 24th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast with U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and we're usually in between episodes right now, but Senator Grassley called in today to share some important updates on estate tax proposals and other issues that we wanted to pass along to you right away. Of course, if you're already a subscriber to this podcast, you are the first to know about today's special episode. And if not, you'll want to subscribe now in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss a future episode. We've got some good stuff coming your way in the weeks ahead. Okay, without further delay, here's Spokesman Editor Dirk Steimel with Senator Chuck Grassley.
Good morning, Senator. We want to focus our conversation today on tax issues facing farmers. But first, can you give us a quick update on how things are looking on your own farm?
Yes, I'll be glad to. But before I do that, I think I ought to thank the Farm Bureau and your podcast for the opportunity of my communicating to Iowa Farm Bureau members or anybody else that wants to listen. I would direct people to at Chuck Grassley for Twitter, at Senator Chuck Grassley for Instagram. And then what I would say is hashtag CornWatch, hashtag Soybean Watch, and they can get a weekly update from me. And right now, beans can be very easily rowed for the first time, and they're probably in, when the soybean opens up, it's two kind of half soybeans the leaves look like, and then they become leaves, and they're kind of in the leaf stage now. And then our corn is rowed now for 2 weeks, but I'd like to describe it as the 4-leaf stage. We got done with corn before the 1st of May, and I think soybeans the first weekend in May. And then the other thing I'd like to say is we're in the process of spraying right now.
How's the moisture situation in your area?
Very touch and go. We got 1 6/10 inches where I live, 1 8/10 inches where Robin lives. I would say for the month of May, that may put us, and I don't put my rain gauge out until the 1st of May. I think that gets us at about a little over 2 inches for May, but we only had less than a half inch for April. So it's very touch and go.
Senator, there are proposals to make sharp reductions in exemptions for stepped-up basis. Why is preserving stepped-up basis so important for family farms?
Well, first of all, you're talking about something that's been on the tax code since 1913, the first time we had an income tax, and it may have not actually been law since 1922, and only once since then, in 1976, I believe, or maybe it's 75, it was actually doing what they did right now. It was repealed, or that may not be the exact word to use because maybe it wasn't completely repealed, but as a practical matter, it became a nightmare for IRS and tax attorneys to administer. And I had the good fortune then as a member of the House of Representatives to get a rural lawyer who knows all this stuff inside and out. Arlie Wilson came out, and he explained to the Finance Committee of the Senate Finance Committee, and I was not a member of the Senate at that time, but he came out and he explained to people just how this wasn't possible to administer, and that 76 law was repealed. Now, that doesn't answer your question, but I just thought I'd bring you up to date on the history that one other attempt to do it, and it couldn't be administered, and I'll bet IRS is going to find itself in the same position if that was. So maybe that history gives us a chance that this couldn't take place. But if it did, it would force people to sell their farms. You know, the average size farm purchased in 1973 could have a paper gains of $2.5 million based on land value alone. And then the STEP Act that you're asking me about would have a $1 million exemption. So there would still be taxed at $1.5 million, and that would be phantom gains because there's no inflation taken into being when this law is applied. So that if they took advantage of paying for it over a 15-year period of time, which I think the law would allow them to do, and that law goes back to maybe the 1980s, they'd still have an annual tax bill of $43,000. Few, if any, Iowa farmers could afford $43,000 on top of whatever else they'd be paying. They'd have to sell off assets to do it. So the bottom line is, why do we want to maintain the stepped-up basis? Because farmers buy farmland to have an efficient operation, and they want to pass it on to the next generation. That's what the Grassleys want to do, and I'll bet almost everybody farming wants to do exactly that same thing and make it impossible to do it, or practically impossible to do it.
There are also concerns that there will be sharp reductions in the exemptions for the estate tax. Why is that a concern for you, Senator?
Probably the same reason, even if you kept up the stepped-up basis. When farmland appreciates as it has, I refer to that as phantom income, unless you take subtraction for inflation away from it. Then you reduce it from $11 million down to $5.5 million where it was before 2017. And you see price lines going up now because corn is $6, $7 a bushel. Maybe off the combine this fall it's $5.5 or $6. And first time you make a profit since 2013 on corn, it's going to increase the value of it. So we don't know where this farmland value is going to go. And when you do that and you reduce that exemption, you're going to get in the same position if you did away with the stepped-up basis.
So these proposals by Senator Van Hollen and others, how real are they? Should farmers be really concerned about them?
They need to be concerned about it because if you couple that threat of the Van Hollen bill with doing away with a 60-vote requirement, which 3 months ago I would have said it's a real worry. Now it looks to me like with Manchin and Sinema saying as Democrats they're not going to vote for it, it won't happen. No Republicans for doing away with the 60-vote margin. And then if they did it by reconciliation and all 50 Democrats stuck together, then it could be done. Now, reconciliation is a process that's only been used twice in the last 5 years, so I'm not sure that reconciliation is a real live thing, but just think there's got to be a lot of Democrat senators are hearing the same thing that I'm hearing from Iowa farmers. I hear about stepped-up basis at so many of my county meetings. It's an issue in the real world, and I don't think Democrats understand that, but some of them from rural states will understand it. Now, I don't see them getting 50 votes even in a reconciliation process to move that along. So I don't consider it a real threat right now, but farmers out there should be telling, whether it's in Iowa or any other state, tell your elected congressmen and senators how bad this is for not only family farmers, but for a lot of small businesses as well.
Let's switch gears a little bit and touch on climate policy. You've supported the bipartisan Growing Solutions Act. Why are you backing this measure, and what do you think needs to happen for farmers to benefit from these emerging markets?
Yeah, don't forget, farmers for decades, at least 3 decades that I remember on our family farm, we've been doing things called no-till, minimum till, more recently cover crops, and there's probably a lot of other ways where farmers are sequestering carbon. So the bill that you're asking me about is kind of a simple little bill, and as it's administered, I want to make sure it doesn't get complicated, and I want to make sure that there aren't some middlemen that step in, but it's to set up through the Department of Agriculture a protocol or a process maybe some other words you could use, that would make it possible for people that pollute and don't want to change their pollution, but they'd be fined for it. They can buy credits from farmers that would allow the farmer to get some income and the people not to be charged with polluting. The GROW Act is that simple of an act. So that's the one you asked me about. Now, the only people that really take big advantage of this opportunity right now to get paid for sequestration of CO2 are people in the forest business. And some of this is going on all right. But the act that you're asking me about would set up a process so farmers would know what they have to do if they want to get money from carbon sequestration.
Also on climate change, the Biden administration has talked about expanding the Conservation Reserve Program and other idling programs. Are you concerned that this has gone too far and that it could hurt farmers?
Yes, I see it hurting farmers, but I also see it hurting the economy of our rural areas because there's so many businesses that are dependent upon selling input to farmers or processing that input after the farmer's ready to market. And you see this in southern Iowa right now after 3 decades of CRP. Now it happens that we have a limit of no more than one county can have 25% of its farmland in CRP. But we've had some of that happen, and it's been destructive to the rural communities where it's gone up to the 25% limit. So when you want to do more of that, we already have some history of how destructive it's been, and that's got to be taken into consideration. But there's other factors directly relating to farmers. During the years 12, 13, 14, maybe even 15, and some of this was 3 years contract, so it could have extended into 16 and 17, because the federal government was putting whole farms into the CRP, and because the federal government had to pay so much to get farmers to put it in when you had $7 corn, and then that 3-year average, it just drove a lot of cash rent farmers out of renting land that they may have been farming for years and years and years when a farmer decided to put the whole farm in. So we made some changes in the 2018 Farm Bill that you couldn't put a whole farm in, that it had to be directed towards the most fragile land that's available. And you could only have the government not out-competing the cash rent farmer by saying that the payment could only be 80% of what the average cash rent was in a particular county. So, those things have to be maintained at the least, but you still have the problem. If the government's going to be this aggressive putting land in CRP, like 30% of all the land by 2030, it's just going to be harmful to rural America and not just to farmers. So I think we have to think in terms of farmers already being excellent stewards of our land, and we are conservationists, and we were that long before conservation was considered a popular thing to do or before you even heard the words Green New Deal.
So you believe that a targeted program would be more beneficial both to farmers and rural communities?
Well, I don't know whether I even want to go that far, but it's got to be targeted in the least. I don't know whether I want to go along with 30 by 2030 because of the impact it's going to have on the agricultural community. And I never even mentioned, but just think, why do farmers produce more than we consume locally? Because we want to export it and help people around the world that are undernourished and those things. So when you have an increasing world population that's eventually going to get to 9 billion people by 2050, I think you have to think twice about, does it meet the humanitarian needs of the entire globe when you have a policy like this?
Let's switch quickly to biofuels, Senator. Are you concerned that the Biden administration's push to electric vehicles is ignoring the benefits of biofuels?
Short term, I think we're going to have a friendly administration for biofuels. But by short term, I mean maybe the next 3 or 4 years. But after that, if you start getting to a point by 2025 where 50% of the vehicles have to be EV, and by 2030, and that's even worse than when it was at 2035, but all the vehicles were going EV, well, then you can see what that's going to do to the ethanol industry in Iowa, what it's going to do to the price of corn, and what it's going to do to the 43,000 jobs that we have for ethanol and another several thousand jobs for biodiesel. It's just going to be very harmful to these jobs, to farmers' income, and to cleaning up the environment that ethanol can do, because ethanol is environmentally positive. I think biodiesel is even more environmentally positive than ethanol. And in the meantime, if you would look at harm to the environment, to mine all of these special metals that you have to have for the batteries that run electric vehicles and that sort of thing, I'm not sure it's as EVs are as environmentally pure as people want us to believe. And probably Tesla and its management people are probably convincing a lot of people wrongly that there's no downside to electric vehicles. But there surely is for the ethanol industry.
You mentioned that the Biden administration may be friendly to biofuels in the near term. Do you think they're going to come out with the mandate or the levels soon, and biofuels will kind of get an idea of what they're looking at for the next couple of years?
Well, first of all, they should have come out with them. In fact, the Trump administration should have come out with them before they left office, but they didn't. They left it to this administration. Now, I've been soft on this administration on this issue for a few weeks as the new team gets in town and as the new EPA director gets going. And I guess I'm not unhappy at this point, but pretty soon they got to fish or cut bait. And maybe when you interview me a month from now, I'll be disappointed in what they're doing on RVOs. But right now, I'm not disappointed. And ethanol and biodiesel, we all know, are critically important to Iowa and to me and to Senator Ernst. And we're going to keep fighting for it. But they better get these RVOs out right now. And it better be in line with circuit court opinions and be in line with things we were promised in the Trump administration, like the 15 billion gallons has to be a pure and solid 15 billion. So if they give any waivers at all, that's got to be made up beyond the 15 billion gallons added to it.
One last thing, the RFS will come up soon for reauthorization. Do you think there'll be a big fight about that, Senator?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I don't know whether we'll do anything through the Congress of the United States because I don't know whether we got the votes to do anything. But we're going to expect opposition from big oil. And remember, oil was for the RFS back in 2005 when originally, and then expanded in 2007 because big oil was being sued in California because the oxygenate additive that they put in their gasoline at that time to meet the clean air requirements was poisoning the water. So they wanted to do away with the oxygenate standards. So they came to me and other senators to get the RFS, and then we helped them get it, and it helped farmers, and it helped clean up the environment as well. But we've been fighting them ever since when they've wanted to do these waivers or do away with the RFS and all that stuff. So I expect we're going to have that fight when 2022 comes around and EPA has to decide how many billions of gallons of ethanol is going to be mandated. And I'm worried that this is one of those things where it's really crunch time to say whether Biden is pro-biofuels or not pro-biofuels, because we can't be less than what we have right now.
It's great to have Senator Grassley back on the Spokesman Speaks podcast. He's quite the busy guy, and we appreciate him making time to discuss some important topics with us. And in addition to estate taxes, you heard the Senator talk briefly about carbon credit opportunities. And that's the perfect lead into a virtual learning opportunity that we'll be hosting for farmers on July 14th about private sector opportunities for farmers to earn credit for their carbon sequestration practices. Iowa Farm Bureau's virtual roundtable on July 14th will give you a chance to learn about the kinds of private sector climate programs that are available to farmers and what you need to know as you consider and weigh your options. That roundtable discussion will be free for Iowa Farm Bureau members, with even more details coming soon on iowafarmbureau.com, so stay tuned for that. We're also planning a podcast episode in mid-June that's going to help prime you for a deep dive into carbon credits and the private sector climate programs available. So remember to subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks in your favorite podcast app. And keep your eyes open for that carbon markets episode coming in mid-June. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you picked up some useful insights from this episode, and I'd welcome you to join us for our next regular episode, which we're going to release on Friday, May 28th, just ahead of the Memorial Day weekend. So you can tune in if you happen to have some extra windshield time over the holiday weekend. In that episode, we'll have Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig on the program to talk about a blitz of new water quality practices coming to central Iowa soon. So that's another one you won't want to miss. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.